history lesson. In 1968, the Methodist Church merged with the Evangelical United Brethren Church to form the United Methodist Church. Both of the predecessor denominations had social creeds, statements about what justice looked like. This had started in 1908 when the social creed was passed by the Methodist Episcopal Church, calling for an end to child labor, a fair wage, and safety standards. Initially, the statements of both churches were included in the discipline, but the 1968 merging conference created a study commission, a committee, to create a unified statement, the first edition of the Social Principles, which state where we as a church stand on a wide variety of issues. The committee came to the 1972 General Conference with language that said, homosexual persons, no less than heterosexual persons, are individuals of sacred worth, period. It does seem worth noting that the Stonewall riot was in 1969 and may well have influenced the intentional inclusion of this statement. However, General Conference fussed over the language, and Don Hand, a delegate from Southwest Texas, suggested that the period be turned into a comma, followed by the phrase, though we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this practice incompatible with Christian doctrine. Changed to teaching. It passed. Thus began the 50 years of explicit homophobia in the United Methodist Church. 50 years and counting. The next General Conference, 1976, added funding bans to prevent church funds from being used to promote homosexuality. The 1984 discipline adopted as the standard for ordained clergy, commitment to fidelity in marriage and celibacy and singleness, and the line, self-avowed practicing homosexuals are not to be accepted as candidates, ordained as ministers, or appointed to serve in the United Methodist Church. I remain particularly horrified that the church wrote in fidelity in marriage and celibacy and singleness in order to attack lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, while claiming to do otherwise. It then took until 1996 to ban clergy from presiding at homosexual unions and to tell churches that they couldn't host them. And at the same time, occasionally, the United Methodist Church would make attempts to remind others that they should be in ministry for and with all persons, 1998, and ask families and churches not to reject or condemn their lesbian and gay members and friends, 2000. Isn't it great that the church asks people not to reject while actively rejecting? The great turn of irony in the 2008 General Conference adopted a resolution to oppose homophobia and heterosexism. Meanwhile, over the course of those years, the AIDS crisis raged, suicides remained common, and LGBTQIA+ kids were kicked out of their homes and onto the street. Clergy were defrocked, and people called by God kept their calls quiet or lived in death spiral closets. Individuals were rejected from their churches and their families, and the church's attention remained on an odd definition of sexual purity instead of on income inequality, poverty, colonialism, sexism, racism, or maybe climate change. In 2012, there was an attempt to acknowledge that people of faith disagree about homosexuality. It failed 49% to 51%. And meanwhile, As you know, individuals, churches, communities, and sometimes even annual conferences refused to obey unjust laws. Many organizations were founded by people who worked for inclusion. Many churches became reconciling 26 years ago here. Clergy refused to obey rules about homosexual unions and marriages. Bishops refused to deny people ordinations, and people of God simply refused to obey unjust laws. And those who wanted control, those who wanted to have authority over other people's bodies, other people's love, other people's sex lives, were really, really upset that they could pass the laws, but they couldn't crush dissent. In 2016, this came to a boiling point at General Conference. And instead of passing more laws from both sides of its mouth, the church created a commission to create a new way forward and called for a special session of General Conference in 2019 to receive and act on their report. The commission called for a moderate way forward, the One Church Plan, which left annual conferences, bishops, clergy, and churches to be led by their own consciousness and faith. It aimed to remove explicit homophobia from church policy, but to protect those who still wish to live by it. Meanwhile, progressives called for a full end to homophobia with what they called the Simple Plan, and conservatives to a doubling down on it with what they named the Traditional Plan. And while I am the one teaching this history lesson, I am still unwilling to share with you all the horrors of the Traditional Plan. The 2019 General Conference passed the Traditional Plan. And as you may know, there was general outrage and horror, and even the moderates in the United States got upset. And it became certain that the United Methodist Church was headed to divorce, with the only questions being which side would exit, where the moderates would land, and how the money would be divided. And then, and I'm pretty sure you two already know about this, there was a pandemic. And here we still stand. 50 years of death and destruction. And so, we lament.
Good morning. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. Today's reading, both of today's readings are from the Old Testament. First reading is Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death, and my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken. But I trust in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. So ends this reading.
I invite you to join with me in a prayer litany of remembering. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for those who lived and died believing they were not loved by you. And we lift up in our hearts or with our voices names of those we know who lived that way. God of love, we bring you our brokenness. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for those who took their own lives because they were told you couldn't love them as they were. And we offer now in our hearts or out loud names of those we know. God of love, we bring you our brokenness. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for those who rejected or lost loving partners because they lived in a church and a world that made no space for their love, including these people. God of love, we bring you our brokenness. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for those who never allowed themselves to find love because they lived in a church and a world that made no space for their love, including these people. God of love, we bring you our brokenness. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for those who asked for weddings or baptisms, church membership or church leadership, and were rejected, including God of love, we bring you our brokenness. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for those who were denied funerals by a church claiming to express you, including God of love, we bring you our brokenness. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for those who have never asked, knowing they would be rejected, including God of love, we bring you our brokenness. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for those called to serve your holy church who never even tried because of unjust church laws, including God of love, we bring you our brokenness. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for those called to serve your church who responded to the call and then had their identity and leadership stripped from them by unjust laws, including God of love, we bring you our brokenness. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for those called to serve your church who responded to the call and then lived in fear, silencing themselves and their loves for the sake of their calls, including God of love, we bring you our brokenness. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for those who have been ready and willing to celebrate relationships and unions or marriages and had clergy ask them to keep it quiet so as to not cause trouble, including God of love, we bring you our brokenness. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for those who have listened to the church debate their humanity, their worthiness, their faithfulness, and heard pure hatred where there should only be love, acceptance, affirmation, and celebration, including. God of love, we bring you our brokenness. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for those whose lives in the church have been limited because of those not present, because they had been rejected by words or silences, including. And all of us. God of love, we bring you our brokenness. Holy One, God of love, we bring you today our broken hearts for 50 years of death and destruction done in your name. God of love, we bring you our brokenness.
Hi, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Karyn McCloskey. I am bisexual, cisgendered female. I'm a member at First United Methodist Church in Schenectady since probably 2006 or 7. And I currently serve as your representative to Upper New York Annual Conference as lay member from this church. And I am also called to ordained ministry. I was called at a very young age, but I was Roman Catholic, and it became apparent as I grew and eventually to the point where I was in my senior year at a Jesuit university that this wasn't going anywhere, and that I was being called out to something else, to somewhere else. And I didn't know where, and I wandered for a bit, and I came upon United Methodism, and honestly, Wesleyan theology and Jesuit theology, Ignatian theology, are very similar, are very, very similar. I think that if Ignatius of Loyola and Wesley met, that they would have declared each other heretics, but they probably would have agreed on almost everything, with some differences in sacraments and so forth. But so this was, in essence, I'd found what I thought was going to be my new home, and I started reading, and I read through the Book of Discipline and so forth, and there are obviously passages in it that didn't set well with me, but I went to a meeting of annual conference, and it was Troy Annual Conference, and those of you who know Troy know that it was big and loud and affirming, and everyone was welcome and clearly told they were welcome and shown they were welcome. And I thought, look at this. It's a book of discipline, but we can change it. Like, we're passing legislation to change it, and wasn't that exciting? And so, what's going on? So I talked to my pastor about engaging in the exploratory process and and so on and so forth. That's the starting point for when you're called in the United Methodist Church to ordained ministry. You start their exploratory process, and you go through lots of things, and you generally buy a book of discipline. Mine is dated 1996. I probably brought it in 1997 or 98. And I haven't bought one since, because I won't buy another one until I have one that I can be ordained under. And so going through the process, and then, of course, I'm interested in General Conference, and so I sit down and I listen to it. It was being, there was not live streaming at that point in time, but you could listen to it online. And I listened to the plenary sessions, and I listened to proposal after proposal after proposal being put forth to change the language in the discipline that excludes. And it went from very affirming and very, very specific and very inclusive, to the let's just agree to disagree. And none of it passed. And now, mind you, this is not on this, that process is very much at the heart of connectional systems, which is what we are, that we group, we conference, and we debate, and we grow and evolve together. And this is not an unusual process in other very sensitive social issues. If you read, and I don't necessarily recommend that you do, but if you happen to want to read books of discipline going back into the 60s and 70s, you can actually see the evolution of the language in there about divorce, specifically divorce among clergy, going from prohibitions to we don't like it, but we won't throw you out for it, to this, while we acknowledge the sanctity and sacredness of marriage, we acknowledge that in some cases the best way to live out as people of God is through divorce for some very good reasons. And I don't know exactly what it says now, but there's no prohibitions and there's no name calling and so forth. So there was a model for this. And I thought in my naivete that we just needed to keep pushing. So I continued to push. I continued to work within Troy and subsequently in Upper New York. And every time I did it, every time someone goes to annual conference, now this is a group of people who are lay or clergy, who are very church oriented, obviously, and who recognize in me the gifts and graces that go with being clergy. So every time I go to a gathering like that, people ask me, "Are you clergy?" Some even go so far as to say, "Hi, we don't recognize your name. Where are you appointed?" And it's like getting hit in the stomach. I can tell you that not being able to live out the way I am called to live, my baptismal vows, is soul-crushing at times. The only thing I can liken it to, and I don't know for sure because I have had no trouble bearing children, is when you ask a woman who has miscarried 5 or 6 or 10 times, "Are you a mother?" And yeah, I've got lots of babies. They're all in heaven. That's the closest I think that it could come to feeling like. It's gotten somewhat easier. I'm surrounded by people who affirm my calling. One who even went so far as to ask me to baptize, 2 who went so far as to ask me to baptize their baby. But it's still there. It's still, I don't know when I will be able to live that out. So I'm thinking next year when it comes time to put on our name tags, "Are you clergy or lay?" I'm going to put it like Facebook. It's complicated. And then when people ask me, I can tell them the story. But for me, and I'm one of the lucky ones, I will tell you that. I, as a queer person of faith, I am one of the lucky ones because my issue has never been a question about whether or not God loved me, that God made me as I am, that God loves me as I am, and intends me to do the things that God calls me to do. There are a lot of brothers and sisters and siblings in my community who don't have that. My issue has always been with the people who call themselves the people of God, but don't live up to that. There are many who think that God condemns. And in that way, I am one of the very lucky ones. I would also say that the impact of homophobia on this church is not limited to queer and trans people. Homophobia and transphobia, sorry. It's not limited to my community. It reaches out. I remember I was sitting at work in Corning Tower, texting with Sara during the plenary session where in 2019 when they were debating the Boyette Amendment. Now, for those of you that are not Metho nerds, the Boyette Amendment would essentially allow conservatives to leave, scorch and burn and salt the earth. They could leave with all of their assets, with their churches, with no liabilities for pensions or for debts. They did not have to pay their anything that was in arrears to the conference. Nothing. They could walk away free and clear through the trust clause. The trust clause would go away. All of our assets as United Methodist congregations are held in trust for our annual conferences. That's the basis for a connectional system. And Boyette would have allowed them to leave. And I remember talking with Sara and noting that she was upset because, here, this is all against queer and trans people, but in a very real sense, this strikes at the heart of all of our ministries. This strikes at, if this proceeds in the way it does, we're not only looking at impoverishing our retirees, men and women who faithfully served the United Methodist Church and all of its predecessors, all of its denominational people that came together through the denominations. So it would impoverish that because the pension funds and so forth are all tied up in this, and they wouldn't have to pay into that anymore, and they wouldn't have to pay anything they still owed, as well as bankrupting the rest of the ministry.